Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, welcome back to the For Food's Sake podcast. Today we talk to Ash Bruxvoort about the urban-rural divide in agriculture and society. Ash coordinates the Plates to Politics program and is the communications coordinator at Women, Food and Agriculture Network, which is a community based in the Midwest in the US with a mission to link and empower women to build food systems and communities that are healthy, just, and sustainable. She's also worked for the Nature Conservancy in Iowa, the Iowa Farmers Union, the Iowa Food Cooperative, and the Iowa State University. Now, Ash is also a writer, and today's topic very much focuses on her recent article in Civil Eats, which is titled, "I am the daughter of a conventional farmer and a sustainable ag advocate." So I highly recommend you check out that article before you listen to this episode. You can find the article in the show notes of this episode, or you can head directly to the Civil Eats website at www.civileats.com, or just Google it, and I'm sure you'll find it that way too. So I thought this article had a really powerful and pertinent message that combats not only these stereotypes and misunderstandings that seem to plague debates around sustainable agriculture today, but also is very much a powerful critique on the politics and society more generally nowadays. So Ash is someone who's very much on the fence of these two worlds and has a fascinating story to tell. So we'll deep dive into her story. We'll talk about how we frame and conduct debates around sustainable food. And we'll also talk about how we move forward from the toxic environment, how we move on from the ridiculing and shaming and scorning those that we disagree with to understanding those that we disagree with and moving forward together. Now, this is something I'm very passionate about. The For Food's Sake podcast was very much started on the premise of debating the nuances behind the extremes in sustainable food debates. So I had a great conversation with Ash, and I'm very excited to share it with you all. And so without further preamble, here is Ash Bruxvoort. We have Ash Bruxvoort on the line. Ash, welcome on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, as I've already mentioned to you, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated your article on Civil Eats, which I think is really a beautiful and a personal story, and something that I think resonates with a lot of people that might feel disillusioned with either the way we talk about food and food systems, but I also think just generally with people disillusioned about politics generally nowadays. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, yeah.
So you talk a lot in the article about the urban-rural divide that separates people politically, that causes a lot of suffering and misunderstanding between people. And I think for a lot of people in the United States after the 2016 election, that became very clear, here in France at least, after the election where Marine Le Pen with the Front National almost won as well. There was that similar type of reaction. When did you first become aware of such a urban-rural divide?
I think that I have been at least somewhat consciously aware of this divide since I was a child. And the first time that I really remember noticing that something wasn't quite right was when I was 8 years old, and I was asking my dad if we could have like some sweet corn. And I'm an only child, and I'm a woman or grew up as a woman. And I remember asking my dad, like, why can't we just eat this corn that you're growing in the field behind our house? And he said, well, that's not for us to eat. That's for animal feed, or sometimes it's for fuel. And I remember thinking like, wow, that's really weird. But also sort of felt stupid for having even asked the question. And that sparked this curiosity for me at a very young age, because it just seemed so weird and like opposite of everything I was taught in school. And so then throughout my adolescence was really interested in food and became interested in becoming a vegetarian, what got involved in like PETA. And so my dad and I were not in agreement on a lot of these issues. And I could not figure out like how to talk about some of this stuff with my dad, but I knew like the kids in my school who were not, on farms mostly seemed to identify with the stuff that I was saying that was from what I call in the article, the coastal food movement. So then in school, I went to school for English and then was just writing about this relationship that I had with my father and how I didn't understand like why he farmed the way that he did, but I also wasn't really sure what to do about it. And then I actually worked on farms in California, in New York, and in Western Iowa. And the reactions that I got from people were just really, drove home this idea that like what the coastal food movement teaches us is the way forward with agriculture. And when I would ask my dad about it, he was like, well, I don't see how anybody can make money doing that. So it was, questions that were sparked from my childhood that I have spent over 20 years basically trying to answer for myself.
Right. And I think what's interesting about your case, as you mentioned in the article, is that you're really someone that has kind of a foot in both camps, so to speak. And you mentioned that this is very much something that's the case for most people that have grown up in rural communities, is that you regularly interact with urban communities, but it's not the same way the other way around.
Yeah, definitely not. I think that frequently when I interact with people, I live in Des Moines, which is a city. It's about 250,000 people, small city. And here there's a lot of attitudes about people who have come out of rural Iowa and they have moved to the city and they really want to reject everything that they came from. And what I've noticed with particularly women that I work with in the sustainable agriculture community is that we are more likely to not want to reject everything that is out there. We tend to have a better understanding of the larger systems that are at play here that force people to make decisions. Because at the end of the day, I talk about this in my article, I think that while I don't always agree with my dad's approaches, I also understand that he is trying to make a living and support his family, and that what he did sent me to college and, I had a lot of privileges. And so I don't think that this attitude that like we should just forget about these white male farmers is the right attitude. And I don't think that it's the attitude we need to actually be changing the food system.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's often, and I hear this a lot as well in debates around food and specifically around diets, is that there's a blame game, that it's kind of conventional agriculture that is the problem, and you kind of always have these same statistics that are mentioned, and as true as they might be, it seems to kind of pigeonhole conventional farmers as the problem rather than the broader food system that needs reform. And you kind of forget that conventional farmers or organic farmers or, small scale, large scale, they're all in the same boat, or we're all kind of in the same boat. And that kind of realizing that and realizing that there's let's say a larger common enemy, if you want to call it that, that's kind of what we need to work towards to, I guess, be more compassionate and understanding and bridge these divides.
Absolutely. So my background is in English, actually, not in agriculture. I never studied anything related to agriculture in school. But one of the things that I noticed as a child growing up on a farm, and then in my analysis working in the conservation and agriculture field throughout my career, has been that the language that we use to talk about things like water quality or air quality in some places is often, the headlines will read something to the effect of, farmers are polluting our rivers. It's because of runoff from farmers that we are having, blue baby syndrome is something that I'll see, protesters often come up with. And the thing that I struggle with is that it's not really the farmers, it's the corporate agribusiness system. And if we're not blaming the like bosses and the people that have the money and the power in this, then we're not actually addressing the problem. And so I'm really a proponent of naming the issue and going to the heart of the problem rather than blaming the people who are doing the labor. And I think that it is a constructed narrative. I think it's a purposeful narrative that is meant to drive people apart from each other. And it's been going on for decades.
One of the things I thought was really interesting about what you just said as well, and what was in the article, is that you have a very unique role, not only as someone that has kind of an experience with rural communities and with urban communities, but also as a woman and a daughter specifically of a farmer. Could you elaborate a little bit on why that's so important and why that's so unique?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is that growing up, the option of taking over the farm or coming into the family business was never presented to me as an option in the way that I think it often is for farm sons. And I'm an only child, and my parents really encouraged me to pursue a career in like becoming an administrative assistant at a huge corporation or something like that. And they really wanted stability for me, stability that they didn't have because they didn't just get health insurance because my dad farms. My mom had to work off farm for that. My parents got married at the beginning of the 1980s farm crisis, and I was born about 7 years later. So they definitely, I did not come into the world with like a financially stable household, and my parents worked really hard to create a stable foundation for me, and they did not want me to take that hard work that they had done and not continue moving forward in that direction. So they really saw farming as a step backwards. I think that it would be, the physical nature of farming was not something that I think they thought that was appropriate for a woman. And when I did decide to start pursuing my interest in agriculture and working on organic vegetable farms, they were like supportive, but also I think kind of thought that it was just a little bit of a phase. So I never really I wasn't in 4-H, I wasn't in FFA, I wasn't in any like regular ag kid things, which I think also like if I had been a son, maybe more likely that I would have like shown livestock or something like that. So it really wasn't until I was in college that I actually met anybody else really like me. And that was when I found out about the Women Food and Agriculture Network where I work now. And that was pretty instrumental for me in learning more about systemic oppression in the food system, because I started communicating with all of these women who had also come from food and agriculture backgrounds, whether they had worked on farms or grown up on farms or were studying rural sociology. And this was finally a group of people that I could start asking some questions to, who they had a deeper analysis that I lacked, as a 21-year-old. So, I think the cool thing about the network is that it brings together a group of people who are typically really isolated. And that was for sure how I felt as a child, and I think is how I continue to feel now. I mean, I advocate on rural issues. I talk about the Farm Bill all of the time, and I live in a city where nobody really cares about this stuff, or certainly nobody my age, no one in like the millennial group it's uncommon to hear people talking about the Farm Bill, which is shocking because we live in the middle of where so much of this is happening, and people really just want to distance themselves from those issues, which, like I said, I think is really purposeful. If people are not connected to rural America, then they're not going to understand the oppressive policies that are being passed right now that are going to negatively impact those communities. And it's not just white people.
Right. No, yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the things about kind of our generation, millennial generation, and it is a stereotype, but we have stereotypes for a reason, is very much that kind of our connection to food is through the kind of term foodies, and that it's the end result of what's on your plate and what's Instagrammable basically, and kind of what's behind that is is often misunderstood or not well understood, or not always with bad intent, I don't think, but definitely, as you mentioned in your article, just a lot of people that have never really communicated with or had a conversation with people living in rural areas, and especially now, I think one of the, I guess, the silver linings, especially in the United States, of the election of someone like Donald Trump, is that I think there's a lot of people that are realizing that maybe now is the time to start having those conversations. And maybe also you could share your experience of having those conversations with your dad. I mean, that must have sometimes been tough as someone that's, has a father that's doing conventional farming and doing the best that he can, but a daughter that's very much into, reforming the farm bill and working with sustainable agriculture.
Yeah, the conversations that I have with my dad are very challenging. I think that if I had not had my father's influence in my life, I would be like many other millennials. And I saw, like, one of the podcasts that you had was about, like, if people knew the truth about avocados. And I think that's a really good example. Right. If I hadn't had, like, somebody like my dad pushing me on, like, well, how is that economically sustainable for that business? Or what is the market? Or how does the labor, like, what is the labor that goes into growing something like that? I would have been pretty complacent and just thought, oh, well, avocados are good and being a vegan is good. But because I constantly had him pushing back on me, sometimes, particularly as a teenager, was like, you don't know what you're talking about. And then as I got older, I started working in the field of conservation. I worked for the Nature Conservancy, which is a global conservation nonprofit. They work a lot with conventional farmers on putting in conservation practices. And in that job, I think a light bulb sort of went off for me, where I realized that my dad probably had more to teach me than I realized. And so I started asking him questions like, well, what do you think about this precision ag stuff? Why do you not choose to use that? And so then we started having conversations about data and, like, his fears around data. And I started realizing, wow, my dad actually maybe knows, like, more about this than I think he does. And we had some really awesome conversations just about the future of agriculture and his fears about, farmers being replaced by computers, which are, like, super valid fears, and his questions to me about, like, how I envisioned the future of agriculture. I would say, like, up until right before the 2016 election. And then we still had some really good conversations. He was for Trump, for sure, but also was pretty open to Bernie Sanders. And I went to the state fair with my parents, and they went to go see Trump, and I went to go see Sanders in the same day. And we talked about it afterward. I was definitely not, like, happy. But and I'm queer and, continue to try to get into my dad's mind that, like, Trump was not really going to be about putting forward policies that were going to be good for his daughter. And I think he, like, understood that, but he's so frustrated with the way that the food system is working right now. And, he doesn't think about it as a system. He thinks about it as trade and the stock market. And I have learned a lot more about economics than I think I ever would have if I wouldn't have been talking to him about this stuff. Because, I think as consumers, we go to the store, we buy food. We don't really think a whole lot about what goes into that food and why it's priced the way that it is. And so has been these constant conversations I've had with my dad about him, like, watching the grain market and watching Market to Market on public television with my dad growing up. That was like, wow, you really actually have to pay attention to what trade issues are happening. And it made me realize that the way that our food is priced has nothing to do with labor at all. Right. And when I made that realization, the idea that we can buy our way into a better food system became just not realistic to me anymore.
I think that's really valuable and unique that you get that type of insight. And as I mentioned with the documentary I'm currently working on, that's very much, it will focus on telling the stories of farmers from their perspective. So it's them telling, it's essentially a documentary series on farmer portraits, with very much the intent of showing that at the end of the day, this is their life's work, right? And that we should first turn to farmers for understanding better how to farm, and then start from there in better understanding how to improve the food system. What I think is also so tragic in what you mention is that there very much is, I think, for a lot of farmers that are struggling, whether conventional or not, as you mentioned, your father and your parents telling you to look for a corporate job, and that there's not this generational, generation to generation farming anymore, and that farming is kind of, there are less and less farmers to start with, and then there's also a lot less young farmers, so to speak.
There's less and less farmers, there are fewer young farmers, and then in addition to that, farmers as a group of people in an occupation have not, particularly in Iowa, been afforded the right to organize. I mean, honestly, the Farm Bureau is the main voice of the farmer, but they are not the voice of the farmer. They're a suburban insurance company, as Austin Frerick, who was running for Congress in Iowa, recently wrote a really good op-ed about. One of the things that really shifted my understanding of the food system in Iowa was when I got involved in the Iowa Farmers Union, and I had never even known that such an organization existed in the state of Iowa. And there are historical reasons for why the Farmers Union in Iowa has been a pretty small membership base and a pretty small voice. And it goes back to the Red Scare. And they lost their charter within the National Farmers Union. And that is, in my mind, a historical attack on the ability of farmers to organize for better resources. And there's so many historical reasons for why farmers are not able to really have the voice that they should at the Capitol. And it's demeaning to those people. And I have really seen in my career, in all of the different organizations that I've worked in and with all of the different farmers that I've worked with, that they are isolated and they don't really have a shared voice. And that seems purposeful to me, because we don't hear straight from the mouths of farmers very often. And when we do, we don't really take them very seriously. And I think that I'm a strong proponent for the social justice movements and the food justice movement. And I really believe in fighting against patriarchy and white supremacy. I also think that we need to be really aware about labor issues and food. And because we choose to ignore a lot of these issues, we are also not addressing things that are happening to migrant farm workers. We are also not addressing things that are happening to people of color who can't get access to healthy food. So these issues are affecting a lot of people, and these older farmers have a lot of knowledge that we need to be aware of, because they're dying.
It reminds me of a quote from Wendell Berry, that kind of the last acceptable prejudice that we have today is the prejudice against rural places and people. And that really kind of sums it up.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good quote and really does sum up the heart of the issue. And I think that this is one of the most important conversations that we need to be having right now to build a better world. And I remember I was on a panel with the woman who founded the organization I work for now, Denise O'Brien, her and two other women farmers, all organic vegetable farmers. And I'd been working on farms. On this panel, people asked, what can we do to create a better food system? And all of the three women who were vegetable farmers had great ideas about how we can support women and marginalized farmers and people who are doing unconventional or, vegetable farming or sustainable farming. And I remember my voice shaking. I was so scared to say this in front of a room full of people who were like really hot on local food. And I said, well, we also need to remember that we have to support these other farmers who have been doing this work for a long time. And we need to be helping them do these transitions, and we need to be helping them get economic resources too. And I was honestly terrified, because that is not a popular thing to say in like local food circles. And there were a lot of, particularly, I would say, older women in the room who stood up and clapped and applauded and were like, thank you for saying that, because nobody wants to. And that was a big eye-opening moment for me, that like the way that I felt and the way that I feel is shared by many people, and it's shared by many women in rural America. But it's not a popular opinion in liberal groups, and that makes it harder to speak up about it. And like one of the fears that I had when writing that essay and publishing it was that people were going to say that I was defending white supremacy. And I think that that's like a really big distinction that we need to start making and talking about more, is that rural does not equal white supremacists. The way that the narratives are being crafted right now, that really is what a lot of people have in their head.
Exactly. That's what I was just going to say, is that kind of this whole debate about farming and the rural-urban debate is just one big microcosm for the political debate that we're having. And it's almost taboo to try and cross the aisle and kind of bridge the divide, because it's as if you're giving up some of your principles or you're letting the others off the hook. But as long as we keep these sides entrenched, and I see this in all debates, whether it's, food and sustainability or politics or what have you, kind of the more you're shouting at the other side, the more they're just going to react with the kind of counter politics, just the polar opposite of yours. And as long as you keep doing that, I mean, it's just a never ending game, really.
Totally. Like just last week, I was having a conversation with my dad about ICE and some of these ICE raids that have been taking people out of our communities here in Iowa. And my dad watches Fox News, thinks and believes strongly that those ICE agents are just doing their jobs, and that people who are here illegally should be deported. And we had a pretty hard conversation, at which, like, at the end, I essentially said and got him to agree with me that he probably has a lot more in common with those immigrants than he does with, like, the people who are running Monsanto or Donald Trump. And so I think people are really desperate for change at all different levels. I don't think that just because somebody voted for Donald Trump that they're necessarily a white supremacist or, even necessarily racist. There's obviously cognitive dissonance that comes into that. But yeah, I mean, I've also had to do a lot of consciousness raising in my own life. So I remember when I believed many things that I no longer believe. So I don't think that it's this lost cause. And I think these are really important conversations that people are afraid to have. Sure.
Yeah. And that just brings me on to one of my final questions, which is maybe a difficult question, but as someone in your position that has kind of seen both sides and that's kind of trying to bridge these divides, how would you say people that have kind of spent either their whole lives in rural communities or more likely their whole lives in urban communities, like how do we really start to bridge these divides, I guess, in food more generally and I guess in politics more generally? I mean, obviously having conversations like this is a start, but what's kind of your take on that?
I think that there needs to be a movement to have in-person group conversations in communities. And I think one of my favorite examples of this is an organization. It's called Trees. I think that it's transgender resource education something service. And their website is webeetrees.org. But it's this transsexual woman. Her name is Megan Buell, and she's based in rural Indiana, and she goes into rural communities across the United States, primarily the Midwest, to have just open conversations with anyone who wants to come to ask her about her life. She can ask them about their lives. And she says, she says in an interview that I did with her something like a lot, which actually Kayla makes a similar comment in the My Civil Eats article, that a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to learn, and they haven't had the opportunity to try to learn. And so I think, that's two examples of women who are going into communities and having hard conversations, particularly in rural America. I think for me, I'm always the one in a room full of people here in Des Moines that if a sweeping comment is made about rural America, I'm always the first person to raise my hand and say, I don't agree with that. And that's what we need more people to start doing. I know after I wrote my essay and it was published, had a lot of women who grew up on farms reach out to me that said, like, yeah, I learned to cover up like my dirty shoes a long time ago. And I don't advocate for rural Iowans anymore because it's unpopular to do so. Well, people need to start not being afraid to do that anymore, because it's really, we are contributing to this divisive narrative and we are playing into the hand that is dividing us. So more people need to start being the ones to say, I don't agree with that. I don't think that rural America equals white supremacists. And a lot of the people who voted for Trump, many of them did it for racist reasons, but a lot of them also did it just because they're fed up and they think that urban people have forgotten about them, and they feel like in America that the Democratic Party has forgotten about them. And so we need to have people advocating and saying that that's not true, and that's not who we are, and that's not what we're representing. So I think it's those in all different communities, but then also just taking it upon yourself as an individual, that when you hear comments like that, pointing it out and saying, no, that's not good, and here's why.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and a great note to finish on. It's something that, as a non-American, I can surprisingly relate a lot to living in Europe. We don't have, as I mentioned, Marine Le Pen didn't win the elections here, but the sentiment is strong, and the kind of rural-urban divide is, at least from my perspective, stronger than ever. So everything you say is as relevant here in France and in Europe as it is in the States. And so thanks so much for doing this work. And I really look forward to, so you're releasing another article soon in Civil Eats, kind of a follow-up on this article, if I remember correctly.
I don't have a placement for it yet, but yeah, I'm working on an article. What's very much what we've been talking about, why fighting, I call it rural shaming, is key to fighting white supremacy.
That's great. Yeah, no, I really look forward to reading that. So thanks so much.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, thanks so much.
That is it for now, guys. As always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by subscribing via iTunes, by rating and reviewing the show via iTunes. You can find, stream, and listen to the podcast on all of your favorite podcast apps, or you can go directly to our website, that's www.forfoodsake.me, and stream them directly from there. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The social media handle for all those platforms is For Food's Sake Me. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.